These are chapter 15 notes, and chapter 15 is the last chapter we'll do this semester in economics. So thanks if you've made it this far. Haven't dropped out of school yet because of these. I'm doing this one on my Chromebook for the first time, so bear with me. Anyway, so chapter 15 is about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve System. So monetary policy is, in effect, how much money exists in a country. And so we'll focus on US monetary policy. Hey, how many dollar bills should exist? Who determines that? How does that work? What's the structure in charge? So there's a quick answer for that. It is the Federal Reserve System, or the Federal Reserve banking system. So there are Federal Reserve banks throughout the United States. Almost every country in the world has something called its central bank, and the Fed, for short, or the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Federal Reserve System, just called the Fed usually. The Fed is the United States' central bank. So the Bank of England is the central bank for England, and France has a central bank, and Saudi Arabia has a central bank, and Russia, and so on. Anyway, so what's up with the Fed here in the U.S. in particular? How does it look? What's its organization? What is the structure? So hopefully you remember some government class, right? With 3 branches of government. You talked about executive, judicial, what was the other one? Right, legislative, good. Making laws, enforcing laws, interpreting laws, that stuff. Interestingly, the Fed is almost like a 4th branch of government. It does not exactly fit neatly under one of those other 3 branches, more or less. It's part of the executive branch. Its job is to carry out laws, kind of. Very weirdly, it is technically not even part of government. So it's technically a quasi-private enterprise, meaning not a public enterprise, meaning not a government body. Now, that said, the heads of the Federal Reserve banks, which we'll talk about, but anyway, the top level of this Fed system is in fact appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. So, I mean, it does have lots of similarities to lots of other government roles and so on. So anyway, I'll kind of try to not refer to it as a government body, but it is in so many ways like a government body, even if not quite technically true. But anyway, so there you go, is sort of where the Fed exists, sort of, in the world. But then what does this thing look like? What is this Fed system that is in charge of our money? So it is an organization that is made up of 12 banks. Look at page 402 in your textbook, and we'll see a map in a second here too. But there are 12 banks throughout the U.S. This system was created back in the early 1910s, 1913, 1914. And basically, it was the 12 most important cities in America in 1913. And guess what? St. Louis was one of those. And they're heavily sort of biased towards the East Coast and the sort of the upper Midwest places, of course, where industrialization was happening, population was growing. Anyway, so, the Fed system still looks like 1913 America in terms of where the Fed banks are. But anyway, so we'll talk more about that. But the important part here is there are 12 banks, and they are not banks like I can't go in and open an account at the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. In fact, once in high school, before I ever knew what the Fed was, I parked downtown and was going somewhere. And anyway, I needed change for a parking meter. And I had parked right by the Fed Bank, and I looked up and it said Federal Reserve Bank. I was like, oh, well, it's a bank. I'll run in and get change. And I walked in the lobby, and it was the weirdest experience ever. It was not like a normal bank. There were not tellers. But there was one window with bars on it. And I walked up and talked to the woman who I thought was like a normal bank teller and asked for change for $1 bill. And she looked at me like I was insane and said she didn't have change. It's like, what kind of bank is this? Anyway, so that is still there, actually, in downtown St. Louis, the Federal Reserve Bank. It's tougher to get into now. Thanks, Osama. But anyway, we'll talk more about that, too, as we go through the chapter. So what do these 12 banks do? They're sort of a bank capital for a banking region of the U.S., and these 12 Fed regions, or 12 Federal Reserve Bank regions, basically are in charge of monetary policy for that geographic part of the United States. It is also the very first place where money is distributed to other banks. So there are 12 of these banks: New York, Boston, St. Louis, Chicago, Dallas, San Francisco. Anyway, it's when a dollar bill is born, it is first born in one of those 12 places. So like a dollar bill will never first appear in Collinsville or I don't know, Memphis, but it will first appear in St. Louis because we have one of those 12 banks. Anyway, so there are these 12 banks. Whoops, not ready for that yet. There are these 12 Federal Reserve banks. Each one of those is run by a governor of a Federal Reserve Bank. And the governor of a Federal Reserve Bank is the woman or man who is appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate for long terms. So they're supposed to be independent of political pressure. And then those 12 Federal Reserve Bank governors make up a board of governors. And from those 12 people, sensitive Chromebook, sorry. From those 12 people, from those 12 Fed governors, a smaller subgroup makes up the Federal Open Market Committee, or the FOMC. And they're really the really key players in determining what American monetary policy is. So we'll talk more about that right now. Because what the heck is the function of the Fed? Well, it sets monetary policy, which means the amount of money in circulation. Literally, how many dollar bills should get printed and sent out into our economy. So people argue bitterly, right? Democrats, Republicans, Trump, Biden, this, but, forever, Reagan, Carter, that. I mean, the fights have been endless about taxes and spending and, what's government's role and in the economy and so on. And of course, all those things are important, right? Like if government is spending more on unemployment insurance or building hospitals or cutting taxes or raising taxes, like that has a big impact on the economy and my pocketbook and you name it. But often in sort of that general political mud fight stuff, often left out, I think, is any real serious examination of the Fed. And so if we're so concerned about like, what's the value of a dollar to me? What's the value of my paycheck? How much is a grocery store bill? All that stuff. Boy, the value of the dollar is very important in that. Just like the value of the peso is important in Mexico and the value of the pound is important in Britain and so on. Well, what determines the value of that dollar? Well, lots of things, but one of the fundamental ones is literally just how many of those dollar bills exist. Like if the government just starts printing dollar bills like crazy, guess what happens to the value of each one of those dollar bills? It goes down dramatically. Massive inflation. This happened, of course, in Germany before World War II, really giving rise to the Nazi political party or allowing them to exercise political power, because people were so fed up with inflation and Hitler and the Nazis say they'll fight it and so on. But anyway, so the amount of money, like literally the number of bills in circulation, really is an incredibly important factor in the worth of any one of those dollars. And so we do not trust Congress, or we do not allow Congress, or our current system does not say Congress gets to determine how many dollar bills exist. The president does not get to determine. The Secretary of the Treasury does not get to determine. The Supreme Court. Anyway, there is one body that determines how many bills exist, how much money exists in circulation, and that's the Federal Reserve System. And so that affects the amount of credit, which then affects business activity in the economy. Okay, so monetary policy, literally how much money exists in your economy. The Fed is the system we've created, 100 plus years old now, to run that monetary policy, and that's 12 banks. And where are these 12 banks? Hey, look, they're here. So each one of those numbers is a Federal Reserve region. So like we are at the moment sitting in region. Yes, 8. Excellent. Great job. With St. Louis in effect as the capital where the Federal Reserve Bank physically actually is. It's down in downtown St. Louis, kind of by the ballpark. So you can see the capitals, you can see the regions, you can see sort of how huge those western regions are, how small those northeastern regions are, and so on. But anyway, there's never been a real serious attempt to remake the Federal Reserve regions either, to my knowledge anyway. And so these are them, and they'll probably be here for a long time. If you ever actually look on a dollar bill, it will have a number on it, 1 through 12, and that means that's one of the 12 places where it was born. And then on the front of the bill, in a little circle at the bottom, it'll actually say one of those 12 cities. Like it'll say Boston, Massachusetts, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Atlanta, Georgia. A number 8 bill will say St. Louis, Missouri. But anyway, we can examine that later too. So besides, I'm going to move down for a moment and then I'll move back up. But so besides The monetary policy bit, how much money exists, which is the most important part, and we'll certainly spend more time on that throughout this chapter. But for the rest of today's notes, we're just going to talk about all the stuff the Fed does that's not monetary policy. So if a regular bank, I bank at UMB, my wife banks at FCB, if you have a banking account, if you go deposit your grass cutting money, babysitting money, whatever, right, in your savings account, you have a bank. Your parents have banks. Probably. Not everyone, but lots of people have banks, of course, right? Those are private banks, private industry. Almost all of those banks are members of the Fed system. Small banks that operate in only one state do not actually have to be, but these days, almost every single bank in the country is a member of the Fed system. All nationally chartered banks, if the bank operates in 2 or more states, it has to be a member of the Fed system, and even all the other banks basically are. Okay, what happens if you're a part of the Fed system and you're a bank? One, the Fed does check clearing for you. So fewer and fewer checks are being written these days because of the electronic fund stuff that's happening. But if I write a check at Schnucks today on my bank, UMB, and I deposit it at Schnucks, well, Schnucks has to find a way to get that money from my bank account, right? And Schnucks doesn't go to UMB. Schnucks takes that check to its bank and deposits it. So the Schnucks bank, in fact, has to then go and take that money out of my account, right? And anyway, there's this real interconnected network of banking transactions that happens to the tune of probably billions of transactions every day, at least millions, of check clearing. And it used to be banks had to do this all on their own, and it was quite time consuming and cost them lots of money. Anyway, the Fed came along and said, we'll do all that for you. You guys send all your checks to us, and we'll figure it all out and send a report out every single day. Hey, Bank A, you owe Bank B this much money. Bank B, you owe Bank C this much money. C, you owe A this much money. Take it out of Schusky's account, put it in Schnucks' account, so on. So the Fed helps do that for member banks. Now, member banks still do some of that too, but they'll then turn some of that over to the Fed. And that still happens every day. So the Fed does check clearing. Banks really like that. And the Fed also runs this thing called the FDIC, or the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. In the Great Depression, banks literally failed and went bankrupt. And if I had money in my bank and it went bankrupt, I lost my money. And that wasn't fun. And it caused a run on banks. People went to take all their money out of banks before the bank failed, so they wouldn't be the last person in line when no money was left, and so on. Anyway, the federal government, part of the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt and all that. Anyway, they stepped in, ran this program through the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve banks, but said that they were going to create this thing called Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which literally is money insurance. I, of course, insure my car and my house, but I don't ever really think about insuring my money. Well, I don't have to for the money that's in a bank because it's automatically insured through FDIC. So if my bank goes bankrupt tomorrow and I lose all of my life savings, all $39.14, I'm insured. I get a check for $39.14 from the government or from the Fed through the FDIC. Anyway, that insurance goes up to $250,000. So if you have $250,000 in a bank that goes bankrupt, hey, the FDIC will hand you a check for $250,000. So banks love that, right? Because it is free insurance in effect for banks, and we consumers should probably enjoy that. So those are two things, check clearing and FDIC, that the Fed does for banks that banks really enjoy. So then there are two more things that the Fed does that banks don't like, but they're willing to put up with it because of those two sort of carrots, right? And so here are sticks. Consumer protection. The Federal Reserve sends accountants into member banks at least once a year to literally check their books. Make sure that they're not lying, hiding stuff, throwing money away, something. So as a consumer, I love that some outside body, the Fed, is coming in and doing audits. Accountants are going through and checking to make sure UMB, where I bank, is doing everything right to make sure my money is safe in there and all that. Yeah. And then lastly, and we'll talk more about this in a different section of chapter 15 notes, but the Fed also goes and tells banks how much money they have to have around. Because when I deposit my paycheck into my bank doesn't hold on to all that money. It needs to take some of that money at least and go give it to someone else as a loan. And we'll talk more about that. But it's the Fed that actually runs this reserve requirement or determining how much money a bank has to keep on hand every day. So banks aren't big fans of either the consumer protection side or the being told how much money they have to have around side. But again, they'll put up with those two sticks for those 2 carrots of FDIC and check clearing. And regardless, for almost every bank these days, if it's in more than one state, by law, it has to be a part of the Fed system anyway. So anyway, almost every bank's part of the Fed. Next time you go to your bank, check it out. If you see that FDIC circle on a sticker anywhere, if you're allowed inside banks, that means it's part of the Fed system. So anyway, that's our Chapter 15 first part, kind of Section 1 part of our notes. And thanks for putting up with those. And hopefully I can figure out how to end Screencastify. And I'm so not cutting any of this. What a fantastic end. You can see my bumbling through all of it. See ya.